Hey everybody, this is Jake from Wild Academy, and today we're going to be going over logical fallacies. So this is for anybody who wants to get better at debate, or anybody who's studying to take the LSAT, which is the law school admissions test, which is similar to the MCAT, the medical school admissions test. I've done this in audio form only. There is no imagery. I've uploaded them as podcasts and as YouTube videos, but there is no imagery in the videos because this is something that you're going to have to listen to more than once. And I want it to be one of those things that you can listen to while you're driving. A lot of times we're driving, we're walking to class, we are doing yard work, and so those are the best times that you can just throw some earbuds in. Before we get started, what I want you to do if you're watching this on YouTube is to just add this to your watch later view list or add it to another playlist like a studying playlist or anything like that. Because as I said, this is so long and there's so much information that you're going to probably not have time to completely finish this with what you're doing right now, but you'll be able to go back to it and it'll save your position and all that. And again, I would recommend going over it multiple times. If you're really going to law school, you definitely want to go over this multiple times. But let's go ahead and get started because that's what you're here for. So what is a fallacy? So a fallacy is an argument that uses poor reasoning. And when you are debating somebody, typically whatever their claim is, there's always a logical fallacy within there that you can find. So there's enough logical fallacies that you will be able to point one out at some point in any conversation that you have with anybody. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what they say is untrue. It just means that either the method that they're using to get to that conclusion is faulty. And again, faulty might not be the right word. That's maybe too strong of a statement. The point that I'm trying to make here is that just because you can find a logical fallacy in somebody's argument does not necessarily mean that it is not true. So this is going to be really fun. As we go through these logical fallacies, try and think of examples. So for post hoc, try and think of an example of an argument that is a post hoc fallacy. And go ahead and put it in the comments and then just say, this is the post hoc, here's an example. If you don't know what they are or which fallacy is this best suited under, just write the argument into the comments and then we will go over it and we'll say exactly which one it is and where it belongs. Let me quickly state which logical fallacies we will be covering. You may have heard of these before and we're going to be going into detail on all of them. Slippery slope, begging the claim, circular argument, red herring, strawman, argumentum ad populum, moral equivalence, ad hominem, false dilemma, post hoc ergo propter hoc, hasty generalization, genetic fallacy, no true Scotsman, argument from authority, and the last one we'll cover today is inductive reasoning. So let's start with our first fallacy, which is slippery slope. It's a form in which a person asserts that some event must inevitably follow from another without any rational argument. So you can imagine that you're standing on a slippery slope, like the edge of a mountain, and that if we just barely move over that it's so slick that we're going to slip and fall all the way down the mountain. So that's kind of just your visualization. So the slippery slope argument states that a relatively small first step is going to lead to a chain of unrelated steps, and it's going to culminate into some significant effect, much like an object given a small push over the edge of that slope that I referred to earlier, will eventually and quickly go to the bottom. The fallacious sense of slippery slope is often used synonymously with continuum fallacy, and that it ignores the possibility of middle ground and assumes a discrete transition from category A to category B. So an example of slippery slope is, if he smokes marijuana, tomorrow he'll be a crack smoker. Next fallacy, begging the question or begging the claim. Begging the question means that you assume something within the question. An example of this would be, how long have you been beating your wife? Or how long have you been cheating on your schoolwork? By asking an individual that, you are assuming that they already have been cheating without first verifying that they have been cheating. By assuming this, you are attempting to put power into your claim because you are stating it as if it is already fact. Now, Aristotle talked about begging the question. Now, this is from him, and it's a little convoluted, but I'm going to go ahead and read it to you anyways. And since we're going to be listening through this multiple times, we'll get it. Begging or assuming the point at issue consists, to take the expression in its widest sense, of failing to demonstrate the required proposition. But there are several ways in which this may happen. For example, if the argument has not taken syllogistic form at all, he may argue from premises which are less known or equally unknown, or he may establish the antecedent by means of its consequence. For demonstration proceeds from what is more certain and prior. Now, begging the question is none of these. If, however, the relation of B to C is such that they are identical, or that they are clearly convertible, or that one applies to the other, then he is begging the point at issue. Begging the question is proving what is not self-evident by means of itself, either because predicates which are identical belong to the same subject, or because the same predicate belongs to subjects which are identical. Let's move on to the next fallacy. Circular argument or circular reasoning. This takes the form of A is true because B is true, and B is true because A is true. This can be harder to detect when there are multiple items. So if it's A is true because B and C are true, and then B is true because C and A are true, and then C is true because A and B are true. That chain can get very long, and that's why it's harder to detect. It's also harder because you have to take down each individual claim and say, no, this is why this individual claim is untrue, and all your other claims have not been tested yet, and therefore we cannot assume anything until we have first gone through each individual one of these claims. The next fallacy we're going to cover is called a strawman argument. A strawman argument is when an argument is made that is not going against the original argument, or a case is made against an argument that is not the original argument that the opponent is making. So to be successful, a strawman argument requires that the audience be ignorant or uninformed of the opponent's original argument. So it's based on the misrepresentation of your opponent's first argument. It's typically called attacking the strawman, and it implies that there's an adversarial polemic or combative debate, and it creates the illusion of having completely refuted or defeated an opponent's proposition by covertly replacing it with a different proposition. Let's break it down. Person 1 has position X. Person 2 disregards certain key points of X and instead presents the superficially similar position of position Y. The position Y is a distorted version of X and can be set up in several ways, including presenting a misrepresentation of the opponent's position, 2, quoting an opponent's words out of context, i.e., choosing quotations that misrepresent the opponent's actual intentions, 3, presenting someone who defends a position poorly as the defender, then denying that person's arguments, thus giving the appearance that every upholder of that position, and thus the position itself, has been defeated. 4, they invent a fictitious persona with actions or beliefs which are then criticized, implying that the person represents a group of whom the speaker is critical. 5, oversimplifying an opponent's argument and then attacking this oversimplified version. Person 2 attacks position Y, concluding that X is false, incorrect, or flawed. This reasoning is fallacious because attacking a distorted version of a position does not address the actual position, the ostensible argument that person 2 makes from the beginning. Don't support X because X has an unacceptable or absurd or contradictory or terrible consequence. However, the actual form of the argument is don't support X because Y has an unacceptable or absurd, contradictory, or terrible consequence. This argument does not make sense. It is a non sequitur. Person 2 relies on the audience to not notice this. Here's a clear example of a strawman argument. If I were to make the claim that the current public education system in the US is ineffective and that we need to find an alternative, and then my opponent starts out his counter-argument by stating that my claim is that I do not believe education is important. And then he begins to make all of these reasons why by stating education will improve the overall wealth of society, it makes people more informed, and he makes all of these clear, easy, obvious claims, but he's not actually addressing my original argument. Instead, he's created a straw man that is easy to defeat, and it is actually not what is being discussed. Our next fallacy is the red herring. Now, red herring is kind of similar to a straw man, but unlike a straw man, which is premised on the distortion of the other party's position, the red herring is seemingly plausible, though ultimately irrelevant, and it's a diversionary tactic. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a red herring may be intentional or it may be unintentional. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a conscious intent to mislead, as is the case with a straw man. The expression is mainly used to assert that an argument is not relevant to the issue being discussed. For example, I think that we should make the academic requirements stricter for students. I recommend you support this because we are in a budget crisis and we do not want our salaries affected. The second sentence, though used to support the first sentence, doesn't necessarily address the topic. Next fallacy. Argumentum ad populum. It's Latin for appeal to the people. It's a fallacious argument that concludes a proposition is to be true because many or most people believe it. In other words, the basic idea of the argument is, if many believe it so, it is so. And this type of argument is known by several names, including appeal to the masses, appeal to belief, appeal to majority, appeal to democracy, appeal to popularity, argument by consensus, consensus fallacy, authority of the many, and the bandwagon fallacy. It is also the basis of the number of social phenomena, including communal reinforcement and the bandwagon effect. The Chinese proverb, 3 men make a tiger, concerns the same idea. Next fallacy is moral equivalence. It's a term used in political debates, and it's usually to criticize any denial that a moral hierarchy can be assessed of the two sides in a conflict, or in the actions or the tactics of the two sides. This is similar to the Hitler fallacy. The Hitler fallacy is when you compare the actions of Hitler to anything else by saying, this is akin to putting Jews in concentration camps. That's the moral equivalence. And to say, so if you were to say something, if you were to say that taxes are the same as sexual rape, even though it's taking property by force, it's the same as, you're taking somebody, even though you're taking sexual pleasure from them, but you're taking from them by force, by gunpoint. Taxes are the same way. So they are a form of rape, but clearly one is more evil than the other. So to compare the two is not proper because morally they are not on the same plane. The next fallacy is an ad hominem. There's two types. There's abusive and there's circumstantial. The first one, abusive ad hominems, usually involve attacking the traits of an opponent as a means to invalidate their arguments. Equating someone's character with the soundness of their argument is a logical fallacy. Ad hominem abuse is not to be confused with slander or libel, which employ falsehoods and are not necessarily leveled to undermine otherwise sound stands with character attacks. Then there's circumstantial ad hominem. Ad hominem circumstantial constitutes an attack on the bias of a source. This is fallacious because a disposition to make a certain argument does not make the argument false. This overlaps with the genetic fallacy, which is an argument that a claim is incorrect due to its source. The circumstantial fallacy applies only where the source taking a position is only making a logical argument from premises that are generally accepted. Where the source seeks to convince an audience of the truth of a premise by a claim of authority or by personal observation of their circumstances may reduce the evidentiary weight of the claims, sometimes to zero. The next fallacy is the false dilemma. There's many names for this. There's black and white thinking, there's bifurcation, denying a conjunct, the either-or fallacy, or this one's my personal favorite, the false dichotomy. I like saying the word dichotomy. This is when only two options are put on the table and that there's an assumption that those are the only choices. So this is really straightforward. I don't think I have to explain this one too much. Some examples are, if somebody says to you, if you're not with us, then you're against us. Well, that's not necessarily true. There's a third option. You're not against them and you're not with them. You're neither. And they assume by saying that you only have those two options. Now, dichotomies, even though it's a false dichotomy, there could be three options and still other options available that aren't being presented. And that'll still be a false dichotomy, even though it'd be a trichotomy at that point, not a tracheotomy. That's something different. But not only that, dichotomies aren't necessarily created on purpose. Usually they are, but sometimes it's just them not realizing that there's more options. So it's not always, if somebody's creating a false dichotomy, it's not always their fault. They're not always intentionally doing it. They just don't realize that there is third, fourth, fifth, and sixth options. So it's always good to keep that in mind, because then you have a way of bringing the fallacy up without actually attacking that individual for them trying to hide anything. Our next fallacy is the post hoc ergo propter hoc. Yeah, I know it's long. But in Latin, what it means is after this, therefore, because of this. It's often just say it shortly, just say post hoc. And it's a lot easier to say it shorthand. It's different from the cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Correlation does not equal or imply causation. But that is one of the fallacies that we're going to talk about later. What it is it's in which two things or events occur simultaneously, or the chronological ordering is insignificant or unknown. So post hoc is a particularly tempting error because temporal sequences appears to be integral to the causality. The fallacy lies in coming to a conclusion based solely on the order of events, rather than taking into account other factors that might rule out the connection. The form of a post hoc fallacy can be expressed as follows. A occurred, then B occurred. Therefore, A caused B. When B is undesirable, this pattern is often extended in reverse. So we'll say avoiding A will prevent B. However, simply claiming there could be a correlation does not mean that A didn't cause B. For example, driving while drunk is correlated with car accidents, and it also causes them. This fallacy is the leading reason for drug testing and using double-blind tests. The placebo effect is when a patient feels and gets better because they took medicine. However, even when the pill is a sugar pill, there are measurable results. The sugar pill, is called the placebo. You assume that this pill is going to make you better and therefore feel better and therefore you can get better. It's actually quite fascinating. Not only that, you'll report feeling better just by assuming. So the reason this is done is that they are narrowing down on the actual causes of the drug being tested rather than confusing them with the correlation and the causation of taking a placebo or a sugar pill. Next fallacy, hasty generalization. It's reached by an inductive generalization based on insufficient evidence, essentially making a hasty conclusion without considering all of the variables. In statistics, it may involve basing broad conclusions regarding the statistics of a survey from a small sample group that fails to sufficiently represent an entire population. Its opposite fallacy is called a slothful induction, or denying a reasonable conclusion of an inductive argument. Example, it was just a coincidence. Hasty generalizations usually show this pattern. X is true for A. X is true for B. X is true for C. X is true for D. Therefore, X is going to be true for E, F, G, etc. For example, if a person travels through a town for the first time and sees 10 people, all of them children, he may erroneously conclude that there are no adult residents in the town. Or a person is looking at a number line. The number 1 is a square number. 3 is a prime number. 5 is a prime number. And 7 is a prime number. 9 is a square number, 11 is a prime number, and 13 is a prime number. Therefore, the person says all odd numbers are either prime or square. Next fallacy, and this is one of my favorites, no true Scotsman. It's an attempt to retain an unreasoned assertion when faced with a counterexample to a universal claim. Rather than denying the counterexample or rejecting the original universal claim, this fallacy modifies the subject of the assertion to exclude the specific case or others like it by rhetoric, without referencing to any specific objective rule. An example would be Person A. No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. Person B. I'm Scottish and I put sugar on my porridge. Person A says, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. A cited example of a political application of the fallacy was asserting that no democracy starts a war, then distinguishing between mature or true democracies, in quotations, which never start wars, and emerging democracies, which may happen to start them. Some other examples are, someone were to say, all Muslims are terrorists, and then you respond, all my Muslim friends are against any and all violence. Then they would say, well, they aren't true Muslims. Another example would be, you aren't a Christian if you use birth control. Well, I use birth control, you respond. And they say, yeah, but you're really not a Christian, right? The nicest and most generous person I know is atheist. Your friend replies, well, then clearly she's not an atheist. See, this fallacy is often used by those that lack experience with particular groups, be they ethnic, political, religious, or academic. Next fallacy, argument from authority. This is called two other things. It's authoritative argument or appeal to authority. And an appeal to authority is a form of argument attempting to establish a statistical syllogism. The appeal to authority relies on this argument. A is an authority on a particular topic. A says something about that topic. A is probably correct. Fallacious examples of using the appeal include an appeal to authority used in the context of deductive reasoning, and appealing to the position of an authority or authorities to dismiss evidence, as while authorities can be correct in judgments related to their area of expertise more often than laypersons, they can still come to the wrong judgments through error, bias, dishonesty, or falling prey to groupthink. Thus, the appeal to authority is not a generally reliable argument for establishing facts. There's different forms of argument from authority. One is A says P about subject matter S. A should be trusted about subject matter S, therefore P is correct. The second premise is not accepted as valid, as it amounts to an unfounded assertion that leads to circular reasoning, able to define person or group A into inerrancy or any subject matter. The equally fallacious counter-argument from authority takes the form. B has provided evidence for position T. A says position T is incorrect. Therefore, B's evidence is false. This form is fallacious as it does not actually refute the evidence given by B, merely notes that there is disagreement with it. This form is especially unsound when there is no indication that A is aware of the evidence given by B. There's a contrast, which is appeal to non-authorities. Fallacious arguments from authority often are the result of citing a non-authority as an authority. First, when the inference refers to an inexpert authority, it is an appeal to inappropriate authority, which occurs when an inference relies upon a person or a group without relevant expertise or knowledge of the subject matter under discussion. Also, because the argument from authority is not a logical argument and that it does not argue something's negation or affirmation constitutes a contradiction, it is fallacious to assert that the conclusion must be true. Such a determinative assertion is a logical non sequitur, as the conclusion does not follow unconditionally in the sense of being logically necessary. Last fallacy for today, inductive reasoning. It's inherently uncertain, and it only deals in degrees to which, given the premise, the conclusion is credible according to some theory of evidence. A statistical syllogism is an example of inductive reasoning. 1. Almost all people are taller than 26 inches. 2. Gareth is a person. 3. Therefore, Gareth is almost certainly taller than 26 inches. As a stronger example, 100% of biological life forms that we know of depend on liquid water to exist. Therefore, if we discover a new biological life form, it will probably depend on liquid water to exist. This argument could have been made every time a new biological life form was found and would have been correct every time. However, it is still possible that in the future a biological life form not requiring water could be discovered. As a result, the argument may be stated less formally as all biological life forms that we know of depend on liquid water to exist, or all biological life probably depends on liquid water to exist. Let's look at inductive versus deductive reasoning. Unlike deductive arguments, inductive reasoning allows for the possibility that the conclusion is false, even if all of the premises are true. Instead of being valid or invalid, inductive arguments are either strong or weak, which describes how probable it is that the conclusion is true. A classic example: all the swans we have seen are white. Therefore, all swans are white. Note that this definition of inductive reasoning excludes mathematical induction, which is a form of deductive reasoning. So go ahead and try and come up with a situation or an argument that uses any of these fallacies, and you can either claim which fallacy it is, or you can just come up with an argument and then we'll try and guess it. Either I will tell you which one it is if you don't know, or if you're wanting to challenge either me or the other commenters, and we can discuss it as a group. Alright, so we've covered about a third, so we're going to do probably 2 more videos with more fallacies. I'll put a link to those in the description below, and I'll also have annotations to those so that you can get to them. Hey everybody, it's Jacob Williams from wildacademy.com. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel already, please go ahead. If you're listening to this on Stitcher or iTunes, you can find me at youtube.com/JakeDayWilliams. From there, you can circle me on Google+. Thank you for listening and have a wild week.